Good evening. I have the pleasure of introducing Rachel Lamb. She has studied as an undergraduate at Wheaton. She holds a double master's degree in public policy and conservation biology from the University of Maryland, College Park. And she's currently a PhD student also at University of Maryland, College Park in geographical, geographical sciences. Yes, thank you. And she's worked with the Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. She's been both a past national organizer, and she's currently on the steering committee. Tonight she's going to be talking to us about acting on climate, a faithful response to defining global challenge. So, welcome, Rachel.
Good evening. It's been great to be with you here today. I got in kind of mid-morning, so I got to join the rest of the sessions today. It's been a full day, but a good day. I think you would agree. I want to preface this talk by saying that I know that whenever we talk about climate change, especially in a room with a number of people, my expectation is we're coming at it from lots of different perspectives. We are pretty mixed generationally here, which is wonderful, which also means we're probably going to have different perspectives, or at least the types of conversations maybe we're having with our neighbors or in our family units or in our workplace are all going to be very different. So the expectation is that you're welcome to bring those views to this space. And I want to tell you my story as a way of helping you understand how I came to care about climate change and why I think it's not just interesting, but defining, as the word suggests here, and of particular interest to us as Christians. But also that maybe you might be able to identify it at certain points with some of my own story, how I got here, and maybe it would be interesting to you. So my hope is that after I share some thoughts, I welcome questions, and I welcome you thinking about your own self, your own lens, the worldview that you bring to this issue, and thinking about areas where you might still have questions, or maybe you're not so sure about some things that you've heard, or you know some uncertainties, or maybe you're already really passionate about it and you want to share some of your own experience. I hope we can engage in dialogue together about it in this way. So I want to start with a story. This story happened when I was a junior in college, and it happened with the Environmental Protection Agency. So I know that the EPA in a lot of contexts might seem like a scary agency. They're the big bad people that come out and do a lot of regulation. But this part of the EPA was really interesting because their whole goal was to actually work with Native American communities, tribal communities in the United States. And they were really interested in getting an undergraduate researcher to come along and explore how Native American communities in this country were dealing with the ongoing challenge of climate change. The way they were dealing with it was now, today, in their present context. And part of what their challenge was is they were trying to figure out how to navigate this change that was different than something that they had ever encountered before, and trying to find really creative and innovative ways to sustain their way of life. So as a college student, I moved out to Seattle, Washington for the summer and spent some time in the Pacific Northwest and in Alaska. Sometimes we think of Alaska as its own country, but it is part of our country, and actually there are almost 300 Native American tribes in Alaska alone. So it makes up a significant proportion of the population, and a lot of people are dependent for their subsistence needs on their resources around them. So the types of climate impacts that people were facing there, I could see. It wasn't just something that I read about in a book or that I kind of heard by watching a video, but basically I would get on these little bush planes, and I would fly to a village that you otherwise wouldn't be able to access by road, and I would be welcomed into the community, and my whole role there was to sit and listen to tribal elders, to talk with them, to ask them what they were experiencing, to show me what they were experiencing, and try to get a feel for what was different about what they were seeing. So this might be going down to the beach and seeing significant erosion. And this erosion was so bad that some of their homes were basically falling into the ocean. There are at least 6 villages that are located right on the coast that are basically earmarked for relocation. If they do not move physically, they're going to be gone because their buildings aren't built for the type of weather that they're now increasingly experiencing, and there's a lot of erosion. Okay, this seemed pretty significant. They were also talking to me about challenges they were facing with keeping their food cold. We don't think about that. But permafrost is naturally occurring. It's a good thing. A lot of people would dig out basically the equivalent of a fridge, where then they could take their food, like their meat. They would go maybe get caribou, or they would be out in the ocean and they would be getting their whale or their seals, and they would store it. Well, now that the permafrost wasn't staying cold all year long, they were having trouble because now their meat was actually becoming contaminated, and it was a human health hazard. They were dealing with certain kinds of diseases. When they would otherwise be foraging for different kinds of berries or other seasonal kind of vegetables, they were running into troubles that they'd never experienced. When I was sitting down with one particular elder, his name is Larry Mikuliov, he was telling me how the beauty of Alaskan natives, or in many cases Native American communities in particular, is how resilient they are. So he would talk about the strength that he thinks that their community has. We've been living in some of the harshest conditions in the world for time immemorial. We've been here so long. We're strong, we're self-reliant people. But you know, Rachel, the things that we're experiencing now are, when we go back into our oral histories, it's different. It's not just the same cycles. There's something changing, and it's changing not just our ability to subsist, but the way that we can pass down our culture, the way we can pass down our traditions, our languages. We can't necessarily live the same life that we have here before. And he used the word, which unfortunately I don't know how to pronounce. It's a North Baffin Inuit word, but it means unexpected behavior, unfamiliar way. It was a word that kept being said over and over and over again everywhere I went. We know that change is natural. We go through seasons all the time. We know how to deal with this, except what we're experiencing is different. And then he said, you know, he said, quote, "To be truly human is to demonstrate love, peace, and forgiveness. You cannot live a life marked by these things unless you get the inside right first. And our internal peace was disrupted by the fact that our external situation was in chaos, or there was something different, or there was some kind of change that we don't understand." As a college student from, you heard Wheaton, I had been introduced to the idea of environmental science and some of the wonderful conversations we're talking about here about a Christian ethic of stewardship. And something about right relationship resonated with me in my Christian worldview. But there was a tension for me, because as he was going on to explain how he thought indigenous ways of relating with the world were talking about harmonious relationships and recognizing that something was in imbalance and wasn't right and we were dealing with the consequences, I was thinking, there's so much of this that resonates, except the true reconciler, Jesus, isn't a part of this conversation. So on one hand, I was like, oh, you know, there's so much that I can bring from my own understanding of my faith to this conversation. So there's some tension. But then the other tension was, well, you know, I don't know a single person from my own Christian community back home that either really understands how climate change is impacting people, or they might be apathetic, or probably more likely, they don't really think it's happening, and they don't really think it's a problem. So here I was trying to figure out what my response ought to be in this situation. This kind of experience was really defining for me. I kind of view it as a pivotal moment where I understood and started to begin to put the pieces together in trying to figure out more about this problem of climate change. What was it that I learned growing up and that did two things for me. One, I was a pastor's kid. I grew up in the church. I think that my local church community taught me what it meant to really love God, what it meant to try to love my neighbor and to serve them. And so because I had that, my eyes were open, my heart was open when I was faced with a situation talking with people who were struggling and facing challenges. I could take the lens that my faith inherently offered to me to be open to being concerned and to be empathetic and try to understand. But I also carried other baggage with me. I also carried around baggage that I had inherently a more skeptical lens, because even if we were getting to the point where we could talk about the environment, creation, climate change, that's a whole nother thing. I don't really know what to think about that problem, because all the people that I hear talking about that problem are not part of my immediate Christian community. They're the other. And if the other are talking about it, but the Christians aren't, what am I supposed to think about this? So that's where I actually started exploring more about the problem. I was interested in natural sciences, so I wanted to understand what I could about climate science, ask the hard questions, figure out what kind of uncertainties were there, what that actually meant about what we do know and what we don't, what the impacts were on people. I knew how it impacted Native American communities. Where else locally was it impacting people? How did it impact people in cities? What was it doing to public health? What was it doing in Iowa to crops and different weather patterns? What was it doing there, and what was it doing to my global neighbors around the world, who even have fewer resources to be able to navigate changes that are unexpected or different? The more I learned about the issue, and the more that I learned how it impacted people in creation, the more I began to realize two things. One, addressing climate change was fundamentally linked to my identity as a Christian. I couldn't separate them. The whole reason why I began to care and to want to know more is because of the way that it fundamentally impacted the poor and the vulnerable, and the way that it disproportionately impacted creation itself. And two, I also personally felt a vocational call to spend the rest of my life trying to help us slow the speed of change and to help people be able to adapt. So I'm going to walk through why I think all of us here can at least resonate with the first part of that we as Christians can, based on our own foundations of our faith, have an orientation towards being concerned about this problem and wanting to do something to act on it. And reiterate that there are many people who professionally work on this issue who also identify as being Christians, and why I think that that's really an important space of vocational work and ministry for Christians in particular to be engaged in. So you've heard a number of the speakers before kind of allude to different reasons why we as Christians should care about protecting the environment. Many of those reasons, I think, extend to our conversation around climate. So one of them is fundamentally our call to love of neighbor, to act compassionately and generously, to seek justice. People who are impacted most by climate change are the people least able to adapt. What do I mean by that? I mean people who have limited resources, who are the poor, who, when they're faced with very challenging, let's say, sudden events like increased hurricanes or massive floods or massive droughts, when you rely upon the land directly or you have limited resources to have any other options, you bear the brunt of those changes. A lot of us here have other options. If we can't get our avocados because of extreme drought in California, or we don't have certain other options because there's a food shortage, yeah, it might be an inconvenience, but we don't think about it all the time. A lot of us have air conditioning, so if there's a heat wave, we're okay. We can wait it out. But many communities don't have those additional choices, and they're most impacted. The crux is that the very people who are impacted the most often contribute the least to causing this problem. So I am making a statement that the climate change we're experiencing today is in large part due to human activity. We know this, the science is clear on this, but it gets a little messier when we start to be reflective in how we participate in that. If you say it's from people, is it too easy to just turn our finger and to blame the fossil fuel industry and think that somehow it's just them, big bad industry? If we just get rid of big bad industry, all of our climate change problems will go away? No. There's something corporate about our responsibility, but something individual about our responsibility as well. So that's one fundamental connection. I think that's one that many people can resonate with immediately, because in a lot of the conversations I've been hearing today, when we think about community and love of neighbor, anything that seems to threaten our ability to show Christ's love to others ought to give us concern. So the fact that this is one of those things ought to at least catch our attention. The second thing is that God gave us the call to care for, protect, and promote the flourishing of the world that He created. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, and if it belongs to the Lord, then our responsibility is to not just enjoy it, which we ought to do, and not just keep it in mind, but to actually protect it, to make sure that it flourishes and can, with all of its full extent, give glory and praise to God in the way that He designed it. Climate change that we're experiencing today is not just harming creation in a way that harms people, in the ways that I just mentioned before, but harming creation itself ought to give us pause. So when ecosystems are experiencing increased drought to the point of desertification, and they're fundamentally changing in a way that threatens species, or maybe certain species or systems are going extinct or being pushed to their limits, people who study ecological systems or they study biodiversity, it grieves you to see that. It's an evidence of brokenness. So if we care about loving creation because we love our Creator, then we're concerned about the way that climate change is affecting those systems. And the third, one-third connection relates to what it means to bear witness to ongoing reconciliation. So there are many ways in which, through relationships with each other, with creation, and fundamentally because of our relationship with God, we think of ways to demonstrate that good news of ongoing reconciliation, speaking to the kingdom that's coming, but already here. You can see glimpses of it. We enter into this messy issue of climate change because there is a sense that there's some culpability. It's broken, and we're participating in its brokenness. So if we can acknowledge that we, at some level, are participating in causing its brokenness, it also should compel us to repentance and then working to address the problem together in community. And fundamentally, what we're saying is that we are pointing to the ultimate reconciler who gives us any hope and points us towards any ability to actually work in a really complicated situation in a way of trying to see some good, some change, some way of helping and serving. So if I claim to love God and seek to love and serve that which He loves, I really seriously think that I'm unable to do that fully and well if I don't take an issue like climate change seriously. So you often hear about people thinking about climate change as a defining issue of our time. There's lots of many serious things that we ought to be thinking about and reflecting about, but I actually think this is a pretty significant issue in particular for my generation. So my generation, which I'll say under 30, has never known a world that isn't warming. So according to NASA, who gives us as accurate as possible of readings of average global temperatures, there's never been a month in my life where the average temperature of the Earth has been cooler than average. It's only ever been warming. So the way that climate is influencing my experience of this world is actually pretty transformational. It's pretty fundamental. And the change that we know is happening is increasing in not just its speed, but we're starting to see more significant impacts. So that is coming. The change we're experiencing is due to emissions that we produced a long time ago. So we already are starting to see a way forward. It already is changing the way that we relate to the world around us. And so in that way, it is defining our ability to engage, what engaging well with the world means and looks like. And I think although it's complex, I see the salience of our call to act now in this time, as we talked about the urgency of now. I see that as something that is maybe in this particular situation unique because of the type of problem, but not unique to Christians throughout history. I will pull out two examples here, and they're more obvious examples, but I often think about the role that Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Dr. Martin Luther King played in their time and place. Because if you read what they're writing during their time of engagement, it's not easy. This is hard things. It's complex problems. They're wrestling with what does it mean to be faithful in this context where are having social challenges and putting up against political challenges and trying to figure out what it means to live out the whole gospel in our place, in our time. Dr. King writes in the late 1967, so almost just a year before he's shot and killed, he had made a pivot from talking about just civil rights to recognizing that there was some significant social justice issues at broader, more global scales. And he begins to think about what it means for the church to be responsive during this time. And he says, quote, "These are revolutionary times. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there may be such a thing as being too late." Now, I wouldn't say that it's never too late to do the right thing and to do what we can to address really challenging topics like climate change. But we have to recognize that when there are significant challenges, not doing something is a choice that does have consequences. There are people now, like the people I was describing to you in Alaska, that right now are dealing with those consequences. There is actual real suffering that is happening. So we have to acknowledge that, because not doing something and then suddenly deciding to do something doesn't mean that the choice that happened before didn't have any consequences. I think we know that, but when we talk to people who are in that lived experience, we start to feel it in a different way. So Dr. King was trying to describe, in his context here in the United States, the people who were suffering under a misuse or ignoring their civil liberties and dealing with a lot of persecution in that way. And I think what he's talking about here also has, as I mentioned, an alternative application in the context of climate. So again, if we don't take up the challenge and ask the hard questions about how we ought to act, our paralysis means some people will still pay the consequences. So even if it's not us, someone does. I also think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we might be more familiar with his story. I'm sure if you're in seminary, you read a lot of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But he really wrestled with what he was supposed to do. He is a German pastor during the time of Nazi occupation, and the German church was not necessarily doing all it could to speak out against the atrocities that were happening in their back door. So the church wasn't necessarily doing all it ought to do, but he felt like he personally couldn't not do something. He couldn't not act. And what was interesting about sort of his thought process on this is he says, we're not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We're to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. It's a systematic level thinking. I also think in this case it has an interesting application to climate change because, yeah, certainly we do need to think about what it means to bandage the wounds of victims. So the people that are experiencing that, we all actually are experiencing changes to climate, whether we immediately feel them or not. But people who, in their daily existence is defined by these changes, we do need to do what we can to find innovative ways to help them, to mitigate the harm they're experiencing. But that's not going to solve the problem of increasing climate change. That's actually a more systematic problem that we in particular, as Americans in this country, have a unique opportunity, I'll frame it that way, to actually address head on because of our historical responsibility, but the way that our decisions on a global scale have real reverberating impacts to people across the world. So we want to do all we can to alleviate suffering where it is. But if we want to drive a spoke into the wheel itself, then it's going to cause us to be even more reflective and probably going to cause some of us to feel sometimes a bit uncomfortable. Because what it does mean is that we have to think about what our responsibility is and not just providing solutions, but thinking about how we may have participated, knowingly or not, in creating the problem. So I think there's something fundamental to the ways that these and many other Christian leaders that I didn't mention are responding to the spirit of the times, to understanding both at a personal level. We're not all Dr. Kings, and we're not all teacher Bonhoeffers, but we are people who are in this place and in this time, and we all are Christians with some unified call to be God's people in this world. And so if we recognize what that means for us, there's something individual in our response, and there's something corporate and collective as our response, both as the church and also thinking about ways of avenues for action in our local communities, in our state, and even in advocacy context. I think owning our identity as Christians when we're thinking about climate change, and if we really are serious about committing ourselves to living out the fullness of the gospel, and I mean the gospel that cares about people, their holistic well-being, and the planet together, because as we just talked about, all of that is caught up in God's redemptive plan. If we really care about all of that, I think there are two responses that we ought to condition ourselves or orient ourselves to have around the issue. And they actually were briefly mentioned earlier today. So one is, I think it ought to lead us to fight skepticism in pursuit of truth. So that's one thing I'll talk about. And the second thing is, I think it ought to lead us to fight despair because we can claim hope. So what do I mean, fight skepticism? Well, skepticism is not inherently a bad thing. We ought to think critically about the world around us, and when we don't quite understand something or it doesn't seem to line up with what we think we know about the world, it's natural for us to say, I'm not sure what I think about that. I'm not sure if I trust what you're telling me. I want to pursue that further. I want to ask more questions. So that in and of itself is not a bad thing. Sometimes I think skepticism around climate might come from questions we have about maybe doubting the science, because it seems like, how do they really know? There seems to be a lot of uncertainty inherent in these models and their ways of knowing. So I don't understand how they're getting where they're going. I don't feel it around me in my backyard, so you say that it's happening all the time, but I'm not quite so sure I believe you. What about the risk involved? If I decide to totally change the way that I live my life, or you're telling me that we have to change the way our economy functions, whoa, that risk seems pretty high. Are you sure? That seems like a good idea. Or what about if everyone in your own cultural orbit, so think about anyone that you talk to around the issue, what if they're all telling you that it's not a big deal? Seems more likely that you would listen to your friend or your neighbor or your family member if they're saying, I'm not so sure. Maybe you should just ignore that and keep living the way that you always have. I want to push us a little bit, because I think that those are legitimate questions that sometimes people ask that maybe have answers to in dialogue and conversation. But sometimes I feel like our skepticism that I've witnessed or have experienced is because we think that the only people that care are other than us. There's something that we're not. And so if there's something or someone that we're not, that if we decide that we care, then it means that we have to give up something about our identity. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, who's an evangelical climate scientist, she says that. She says, at the root of fear is a sense of loss. Fear that we would lose who we are and lose our comfortable lives. Fear of change, fear of hardship, fear of not having things the way we wanted them to be, fear of lack of control. But, she says, our identity as Christians is not built on the frames of this world. Our identity is who we are in Christ. And if we understand that, it frees us from fear. I often think people around us are telling us that if you're a Christian, you can't care about climate change, or that Christians just don't do that. I have grown up in evangelical Christian circles my entire life, and I would say many conversations that I've had are, I don't see any churches, my pastor doesn't talk about that. Christians seem to be more worried about other things. It seems like climate change is something we're not too concerned about. But another question that often comes up is that, well, you can't be a conservative, a political conservative, and care about climate change. We just don't do that. That's a Democrat thing. It's a liberal thing. Both of those, I will submit to you, are false dichotomies. They're not true. So first of all, Our fundamental identity as Christians give us every reason to care. I act on climate change because I'm a Christian, not in spite of the fact that I'm a Christian. So I bring everything I already have and care about, all of my existing values, and I bring that to the table. I'm not compromising my identity. In fact, it's because of who I am or who I claim to be or who I claim to serve that gives me every reason to care. I also know that there are many actual conservative solutions to talking about climate change that would really, or acting on climate change, would really help us out. There are really great fundamental mechanisms for thinking about market-based solutions that would help us. So why is it that it seems like that if we say, well, I'm a Christian, or I say I'm a Republican, that automatically means that I shouldn't or couldn't care about climate? I work with an organization called Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. We're intentional about calling ourselves evangelicals because we're claiming, just like I mentioned to you before, that it's because we're evangelicals that we care. And two, we have climate action in our name because one of the fundamental things that we do is try to mobilize people to act and advocate together on this issue. Not at the exclusion of other issues, but we find that this is something that many of our leadership is really passionate about, but also that we think more and more Christians also ought to be concerned about. We're also young people. So there are many young people in this room. We're defining young as 20 to 30-year-olds. We're the generation that I was just talking to you about. Our generation's whole existence has been redefined by climate change in the sense of how we engage with our natural world or how our world's economy is now going to have to navigate new risks that are posed by climate change. When we started YCA, we wanted to create a space where people could, like me, like I was as a college student, and many of the people come, they say, I feel like what I understand about Christianity has everything to do with this issue. The way that it impacts people, the way that it's impacting creation, the way that we think the church ought to bear witness to Christ's love and reconciliation in this world. It all makes sense to me, but I don't really know who to talk to about it because I don't hear anyone in my church talking about it. I don't hear anyone within my own social orbit saying that they also think that it's important as whatever complex identity you have, as hopefully fundamentally a Christian, but many other things, many other ways we characterize and identify ourselves and the things that we value. So we wanted to create a space where young people could come together and ask those questions and then intentionally act by saying that those things fit together, that our mission makes sense because of who we are. And we're able to engage in 3 different ways. So one way that we engage is by building up and mobilizing young leaders. So we've been able to work on lots of Christian college campuses where you have students who are really excited about not just claiming that maybe vocationally for themselves, but helping their campus think about what it means to live more sustainably in their own community context. So it might be doing things like we've talked about here, where we get our food, how we manage our waste, where we get our electricity from. All really good questions, but also rethinking the way we talk about and think about the issue. So even though you think that maybe how we talk about something or how we think about something, maybe you think that's not as important as what you actually do, but we know that in our country today, if you can't actually sit down and have a conversation and talk to someone about an issue that might be really challenging or in some ways controversial, how are you ever going to come together around anything? So we're changing the way that we approach the issue so that we can have a healthier dialogue by not arguing about whether or not it's a problem. Ethically, morally, we can come together on the fact that it's a problem, but there's a whole lot of room for discussion about what we should do about it. There's a lot of room for really great discussion about who does what. What is the role of companies in being innovative in their business solutions? What's the role of the church in advocating for action around something because of the way that it impacts people? Or what's the role of local communities trying to think about new ways to do things like local produce or being local in their agricultural context? A lot of things that we talked about. There's lots of different roles, but we sort of have to get past whether or not it's a problem. And as the church and as Christians, fundamentally be clear that we do think it's a problem and that something ought to be done. So we work with young people in that way. We also work within churches. So We talked about a little bit before about the rise of the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. We actually find that for many people in my generation, they face a challenge where they say, well, I've come to think about a lot of these issues, environmental, social, etc., as really important, but I feel like the church is being silent on them, or they're not really engaging them. So if I have to make a decision on whether I stay engaged in my church or whether I become more vocal and do all I can to address whatever the issue is, you see a lot of people abandoning their roots for whatever reason, but including those. Part of the beauty of the people that I have the joy of working with every day is that we are a part of the church. We are one of you. We are a part of the member of the church, and we care about the church being able to bear witness to a lot of things, including on this particular issue. So I meet with my local pastor, and we have really interesting conversations where we can ask really hard questions, and I know something about the science, so he can feel like he can ask me questions and I can give him the best answers that I know, or find answers for him, or we have good conversations about what we think the church can do. And building relationships with people, because you're much more likely to want to trust someone and what they say if you have a relationship with them. So we encourage people that are a part of this group to just continue to build relationships with people and talk with people, especially people who you think very differently from you or maybe have different perspectives. So we want to remain engaged in the church. And then we also do think advocacy is important. So I live in Washington, D.C. It's not always the greatest place to be, but one opportunity that you have is that you do get direct access to talking to all sorts of decision makers. I've met with lots of different members of the administration and congresspersons on both sides of the aisle. I've also attended the Republican National Convention, and I've been to the Democratic National Convention. Our organization is inherently nonpartisan because, you know what? Climate change is not, first and foremost, a political issue. I know it seems that way, and I know because that's how people talk about it, which is what makes it seem so divisive, but it's not. So if we start there, then inherently we're going to seem like we're isolating people. We're splitting the conversation. If we start by why we as Christians care about the issue and why we're showing up to talk with people, you actually find that people are pretty receptive. And that there's actually more conservative, in this case, politicians than you would think, that are actually open to doing something because they probably recognize it's a problem, but they don't think there's any public will for it because they think their constituents don't care. So often a lot of conservative congresspersons are really interested in the fact that young, self-identified evangelical Christians would take the time to show up to talk with them about why they care about an issue like climate change. So we think that advocacy is important, and advocacy generally, not directed at any one political party or because we belong to any one political party, but because climate change is a really complex issue and policy does play an important role in helping us tackle the problem. So by helping our decision makers know that we care about it, it gives them more freedom to make decisions that are in favor of acting. I often am a little hesitant because I still don't think that gives them a pass for not doing the right thing. I think they ought to do the right thing, whether or not they feel like they have public will. But I understand that in a practical sense, they do want to hear what people, feel about the issue, and they are more likely to act if they feel like you want them to act. So the second component of this, as I mentioned, so on one side there's fighting skepticism and doing what we can to kind of reshape the narrative. In my other part of my work, I'm in academia, and I work with a lot of, mostly actually, non-Christians who are focused on studying climate. They focus on studying how climate change impacts the environment, how it impacts people. And let me tell you, there's a lot of despair around the people that I talk to. There are a lot of people who say, I spend my life trying to understand these systems and try to understand our impacts so that I could get the best information possible to the people who can make decisions, because surely if they have all the information, they'll make the right choice. I know. But so there is a tendency that in that context, you get you take your work seriously, you try to know everything that you can, and you try to describe things as accurately as you can. And when you feel like there's a wall that you just can't cross, no matter how you're trying to communicate how significant and urgent something is, you're not trusted. People are like, you're a scientist, I'm skeptical of you, I don't trust your science, or I just don't know you and I don't trust your intentions. So there is a communication barrier, but more fundamentally, often what that leads to is it just leads to a lot of, not just discouragement, but I would use the word despair. Because often what you have to turn to then is you turn to, well, maybe we just need to do more to capitalize on the goodwill of people, and that maybe if they know more, or we can communicate better, or they understand the science better, that will fundamentally, it will click at some point, and somebody will change their mind on the issue. And often, a lot of the role that I play in that context is people asking me, how are you doing? How are you doing these days about this? Have you heard, we can all get trapped in media holes, but like, have you heard the news? Blah, 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 blah. What do you think about this? What about our work? We seem like this is really important. We're doing all we can, and we're not sure if it's getting through. We're feeling really discouraged. And it's a really interesting place to really talk about what Christian hope really is. Because Christian hope isn't two things. Christian hope isn't naive optimism. So it's not the sense that you're sort of just saying, well, I think it'll all work out. It'll just get better. Don't worry. Like, just keep going and just kind of pressure through, but at the end of the day, it'll just be okay. Because what that sometimes leads to is it leads to some kind of paralysis, thinking that, well, if we know that everything's going to be okay, then don't lose sleep at night being upset about the fact that there's some really terrible things happening in this world, or don't worry so much about kind of blaming yourself or thinking about your maybe part in this problem. It's just a lot easier to say, okay, it's all going to be okay, everything's not in my control, and we'll just move on. Well, that's not, I would argue, what Christian hope really is. Because Christian hope you often feel sometimes when you can't even see it. It's when you're in the midst of brokenness and you see suffering and you see brokenness and you have nowhere else to turn, and yet what you fundamentally cling to is a hope that is certain. It's a hope that you can't always see, but you know that you know the end of the story, and you know that Christ is working in his world, even if at that very moment it's really hard to see. It's something that if you're a Christian, I pray you don't have to experience, because sometimes in those circumstances is when they're the most challenging and you're dealing with a lot of suffering. But it's also those times when you know where you have nowhere else to turn, and that's what you fundamentally cling to, that hope it's just tangible. You can feel it. And it's really sometimes hard to explain, except it really reshapes the way that you think about these major issues. It means that when I wake up and I go to work on these things, it means that I can appropriately lament and grieve over what's broken, because there's a lot of brokenness and a lot of suffering and a lot of things that aren't right. We all experience that at different levels, and especially when I'm dealing with this work, it's appropriate to say this is not right and there are things that are wrong here, and it's appropriate to lament and grieve about that. But when you lament and grieve, it doesn't lead to despair because of this hope that we're talking about. That comes through in your conversations with people, and they want to know more about that hope. Sounds like 2 Peter 3:15 to me. Always be prepared to give a reason for anyone that asks you for the hope that you have. It's there. You have opportunities to. And unfortunately, sometimes it's in those very contexts where there's just a lot of brokenness that's really evident. So I see the role for us as a church of really bearing witness to this hope, and ultimately to the hope. So why do we have hope? Because Christ is the hope, and because he's working in this situation. We're joining him as co-reconcilers in this work. That means that when we get up and we do our work, we give it everything we have, because we can see glimpses of the kingdom. It's a rich privilege and an opportunity that we have, which doesn't cause us to engage in paralysis, but really gives us more energy and diligence in our work. So, to end, if we truly own our identity as God's people, then we are called to live as his people, which means we have to know something about his mission. I love Christopher Wright and his big, massive book called The Mission of God, but he also talks about the mission of God and then inherently what the mission of God's people is. And this is how he puts it. He says, the mission of God is to redeem the whole of creation, broken by sin and evil, into the new creation, populated by the redeemed from every culture through the cross and resurrection of Christ. Nothing is outside of that. So then for believers, our mission then springs from understanding about who we are and our place in God's larger story. So if we claim to be a Christian, then our identity should say something to the rest of the world about how we will act and engage this world. So if they don't see us doing something about what most of the world already is feeling and is affected by and seeing it as a defining challenge that harms people and the environment, it harms our witness. So we have a responsibility to fight false narratives and to stay connected to our fundamental identity of who we claim we are. And there's a lot we could say about both engaging in individual action and corporate action. So we could talk a lot about okay, so what? So I'm on board here, at least I'm getting on board with the idea that it's a problem, but what can I possibly do? It's a huge global issue. So there's lots you can do at individual level, but also there's a theme about corporate responsibility too. So how we use our voice together to indicate that we want to take things seriously. We rejoice that God is present in this world and that he's using his people to show glimpses of the kingdom yet to come. So what a joy and privilege it is to engage in that work with him. And I pray you'll consider what your role might be in engaging in this work as a Christian as well.
So they're getting some microphones for us. So, a question.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of questions and affirmation for what you shared so far. What strikes me is that in our denominational conversations and what's happening right now on Capitol Hill and in the news, we so quickly pigeonhole folks. So if someone just uses a word, right, like climate change, well, obviously they're a progressive liberal or a Democrat, or if someone then denounces, then we pigeonhole so quickly. And what I found interesting is you said in this collection of young evangelicals, in 20 to 30-year-olds, right, as well as the nuns, the NONES, there is not this quick move to kind of pigeonhole folks in perspective or labels. It's so pervasive now, and so I find so much hope in that. Can you talk a little bit more? Is that a generational issue? Is that an issue of a faith perspective that allows you to have kind of a both-and view? Because that's what we're all about here. We're all about both-and. Is that a faith perspective? Is it generational? Is it just that you're gifted? I mean, what kind of drives you and your colleagues, your 20 to 30-year-olds? Because there's some of us that are in our 40s that also share that value. What's driving it in this generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I've actually spent since coming to understand more about my vocational call, I've spent most of my life not being fit into a box very easily, because if I'm in the context of my church, people are like, what do? You study climate change? Like, I don't know how that, like, why waste your time doing that? I don't know how that relates to being a Christian. But I know you, and I trust you, so I want to learn more, but I'm not sure. So it's a relational piece, but, like, there is a dichotomy there. Whereas for young people, it is not, like, I've spoken at lots of Christian colleges, and it is not hard for young people to say, oh, I can see why that's a problem and how my faith speaks to the issue. I don't know why there's such challenges for me in particular as a Christian to care about that. That is not that hard of a leap. I would say generationally, though, if we think about the other side too. So the other side of that spectrum is, in a secular context, people are like, oh yeah, you know, we all study climate here, but you say you're a Christian? Like, I don't know any Christians in their orbit that care about this. So can you tell me, like, how you fit those things together? What was interesting is I just went to a conversation the other day talking about how this next generation is thinking about taking action on climate. And you know who was in the room? People across the political spectrum. So there are people who are like, I'm part of my Young Republicans Club, and I actually think that conservatives should really get on board and start leading the conversation on this for X, Y reason. And then you have people on the other end of the spectrum who also really care about the issue and are thinking about ways they want to use their, resources and frameworks to apply. So even across the political spectrum among young people, there's also not that categorization that you can't, if you're this, that it can there can be movement across this, again, framing of a political issue to be just be a bipartisan issue of concern using different types of solutions. In terms of labels too, I mean, I think it's when people make that they make that personal connection. So that's why I think, in particular, working with young Christians, when you are willing to fundamentally say that your identity is defined at some basic level by the fact that you follow Christ, if you can make a connection fundamentally with that and whatever issue you're talking about, like climate change, then it's like that's what matters. That's what's that's what's motivating. There are lots of other parts of my identity that I hold. You can list off my gender, my race, the fact that I grew up the daughter of a Baptist pastor. Like, I could list them all off, and they inform my worldview. They're part of me and how I see things. But at some level, even though you can't separate that all, if some fundamental level I can say that I fundamentally share the same core convictions of my faith as you do, then we ought to be able to get to a place where we can at least agree that it's a problem, because we're using that lens. And then those other barriers don't seem as much like barriers. Yeah.
Other thoughts or questions?
Do you want to go on? You go first.
I agree with what you say, but I think it's also really important to acknowledge that hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent to set this dialogue in this way, to create divisiveness, to create uncertainty. And so it's more like the American people have been fooled, and it is literally the same people who told us that smoking won't hurt us and pushed off that legislation for like 30 years after the science was known. It is the same people, and they're following the same playbook and doing it very effectively. And I'm so glad to, eventually the truth will come out, and that is happening. So I just think it's important to acknowledge that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know some people might hear that and immediately your conspiracy theory, like, red flag goes up, but there is truth to the fact that there are people whose vested interests are in downplaying the severity of climate change, because if we accept that it's a problem, and accept that it's a problem we want to do something about, that it does mean that we will change something about our behavior. And one of those things is trying to remove ourselves from a fossil fuel economy. So there are people that do fuel into an industry of skepticism and target certain populations because it's in their best interest to do so. So there is truth to that. So we have to be aware of that, because that information, as a quick aside, Facebook is one of those funnels, right? You have your friends and you hear things. They actually do analysis on advertisements, and they target advertisements based on like certain demographic information about your friends. So they'll actually have certain types of ads with certain types of framing around issues like related with the environment or climate that they target you with if you belong to a certain subgroup, because they think you will be more receptive to that information. So again, if every type of information you're hearing is of a similar vein, then no wonder you think that that's general consensus, because that's all you're ever hearing. So which is another good point, that if there's someone that you disagree with or you don't understand, talk to the person. Don't just listen to everything you read on Facebook. I tell that to my generation, but yeah.
Thank you, Rachel, for your insights. Yeah, my question is so obvious that I was going to just sit on it the whole conference, but I'll ask it because there may be an obvious answer that I'm missing. I'm not a denier. I mean, if Rex Tillerson has said that climate change is real and even spoken in favor of a carbon tax, I mean, why deny? But I don't speak about it as often and as passionately as you do. And for me, it has to do with there's probably no issue of the environment with which I'm so quickly brought to my own hypocrisy as on this one. I mean, I didn't walk here, and I'm not going to walk home. I just got back from a wonderful trip to Australia, and the plane was not solar powered. So as a daily consumer of fossil fuels, it's like the who am I to speak about it in this country, let alone in China, where people are flocking to cities in the hopes that a factory job based on cheap coal production will get them out of a fear of starvation, subsistence level of living. You know, again, so who am I? That's kind of the recurring question that I get. Like, who am I to talk about this? Because I would be really hypocritical to do so. So maybe you or somebody could help me with that quandary.
Yeah, I had someone explain to me once that they framed it this way: because of the curse, we can no longer have all good things at once. Meaning that we're faced with tragic choices. That doesn't mean that just because there's tragic choices that we can't make better or worse choices, or that we don't ought to think responsibly about our choices and try to make better choices. But it does mean that, as you're just explaining, okay, right now we live in a fossil fuel-based economy. Some things we have a degree of choice over, and other things, like if we flick on our lights from here, we don't know where this energy came from. It could be coming from someplace that gets its electricity from a coal-fired power plant. But we're using the lights, we're talking about the issue. That's a good thing, right? That's good, see? There's lots of degrees of choices. So sometimes it feels, so first of all, you're talking about hypocrisy. Yeah, I think one first and fundamental step is acknowledging our responsibility. I mentioned that, but I think it's really true. So if we can acknowledge the fact that we're participating in causing the problem, which can be really hard for us to do, but if we can acknowledge that, then we can start to think about it is participating in brokenness and repenting from that, whether that's individual or corporate. You could talk about that, what that means theologically, but then what does it mean to try to acknowledge that and then do something differently? So again, there's lots of different degrees of choices. So you have individual types of choices, like where you buy things, what types of things you buy. We talk about consumption patterns, do little things to help make our homes more energy efficient. Or there was a Christian college, Houghton, if you're familiar with that, in New York, that decided that they were going to invest in this huge solar array. So they now get like 70, I think, % or more of their power from their own solar power arrays. They made an intentional choice to do that, and that was one way that they felt as an institution they could demonstrate their commitment to stewardship. So I think instead of thinking about it as this checklist that seems often really legalistic, where it's like, well, you better do this, 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 and this, and if you don't quite get far enough down the checklist, then you're not really doing all you can. So you ought to be feeling really guilty and ashamed. I've never heard of that being an authentic motivator of trying to act on anything. So part of it is thinking critically about the fact that maybe there are more things that I can do than I think I can do. Some of them maybe are easy changes, some of them might be more uncomfortable changes, but there are increasingly a lot more things that you could do to be more carbon conscious, if you will. And then there's another degree of ability to, again, like I'm talking about the issue to your neighbor, to people that, sometimes those uncomfortable conversations, people in your pew next to you, talk to your congressperson. Those are all potential actions that are open to you. Some people are going to find some of those more comfortable than other people, but there's still things to do. So don't feel, you have to resist paralysis and thinking that, yes, it's really overwhelming, it's hard to know what to do. Try to do what you can do, and then encourage other people to think about ways that they can act too. It's a lot easier to encourage someone to act if you're also doing something about it as well.
Thank you, Rachel, for your presentation. I have to say that it does my heart and spirit well to have experienced a conservative evangelical behind the pulpit in Nicary Chapel. I get news updates from Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, so I know that there was just recently a bill introduced by 3 young Republican legislators on the Hill. And since you mentioned speaking to your congressman, I'm wondering about what citizen lobbying techniques that you might share, because I'm represented by Mike Turner, a Republican, thinking on the Senate side. Indiana, where we are right now, as well as Ohio, where I live, are both, their Senate delegations are split. We have Young, who's a Republican, and Donnelly, who's a Democrat here in Indiana, and we have Portman, a Republican, and we have Brown, a Democrat, in Ohio. And I've reached out to Portman a number of times and dropped the E word, a number of times, and tried to build connections there, especially when the EPA appointment was up in the Senate. And I feel like I'm a fairly competent person. I have community organizing experience, and I didn't get anywhere, and so I'm curious what tips, since this is sort of your wheelhouse, that you would give, because Brethren send youth to D.C. For Christian citizenship seminar, and often have environmental justice-related themes. Like right now, the one for April is food justice for Native Americans, right? And so I think we are a demographic that would really be interested, many of us, in reaching our Congress persons, but maybe don't have aren't well equipped. So do you have, before Jeff makes us move on to something else, a word that you might quickly exhort us with?
Well, general advice is always tell your story and be authentic. So use the words you would use, describe your own story, and talk about what you care. That's the first thing you should do. So don't just regurgitate some other lines that you're not sure that you believe. Just tell your own story, who you are and why you care. 2, you don't always know what happens behind closed doors. So even if it feels like on the public interface, like they didn't seem like they're doing anything, they're not really changing the conversation, sometimes more is happening than you think, and it surfaces later. So we had people going and asking GOP candidates during the first caucus in Iowa questions. They're saying, I'm an evangelical Christian, I really care about climate, and I want to know what your solution is, or how will the free market solve climate change? One of those hard questions that if you're a GOP candidate, you feel like you probably should answer something, but you don't get that question all the time. And at first you think you're not making any progress, it's just a question, whatever. But then it turns out, like later, Jeb Bush remembered that he had gotten that question and actually intentionally brought the subject back up at another town hall meeting. So even though it's just one example, but you never know that, especially if you're just being consistent and you're continuing to authentically tell your message, and if you're bringing other people, it's you plus your friends plus the next time your mom decides she's going to call. The more people that they're hearing from and the more consistent they're hearing the message, it really does make a difference. There's more tools and training too, but.
I'm not sure exactly what my question's going to be, but I'm old enough that I remember before the EPA was here, I remember Lake Erie was dead. I remember seeing pictures of the terrible smog in LA and other large cities. I remember driving through Gary and not being able to breathe. I remember I think it's the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland catching on fire. A river catching on fire. And I know that everyone, my generation and older, must remember these things. And I just don't understand how, what, a fourth or a half of the population can just simply forget those things and let things go.
Well, one thing is that climate change is distinct from those problems in that it's really hard to see. Like, you can see there is oil floating on the top of the river, so it caught on fire. There's clearly there's a point source for that pollution, and we know what caused the problem, and so it seems a little bit more direct about how we solve it. They're a terrible problem, but it's more direct. With climate, it's really hard because we feel the effects, but in some places more than others, and the effect looks different in some places than others. And some of us feel it more directly, some of us don't. And the sources of carbon pollution are multifaceted. It comes out of your tailpipe, it comes out of fossil fuels, it comes when you cut down forests. So sometimes it's hard because even though the science about how those things relate is clear in our day-to-day experience, it's harder for us to connect the dot to the arrow. So, or, from one dot to the other with a clear arrow. So I think that's in part why some people find it harder to grasp in the same way that they did when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. But there is a general principle there that is the same in the sense that the significant problems that it's causing, or the significance of that type of pollution, is the same, if not worse, in some ways.
Hearing Lori's question makes me wonder about that it feels like even the visible is becoming under attack, and so why would we want to go back to that, the very real visible things that would affect us, and so your message of hope is helpful for me to not become paralyzed. How do we bring a little less hope and more reality to our lawmakers who don't seem to have that same respect? I mean, so it feels like instead of going forward, we're actually going backward.
It does feel like that sometimes. It depends on which part of, there's a lot of different things going on, so it depends which part you're looking at. I think it depends who you're talking to. So some people grasp the severity of the issue, or they think they grasp the severity of the issue, but they don't really know what to do about it. And then there's people who feel like it's not as big of an issue, feels like people are being hyperbolic about it. And so you kind of meet them where they are in that, acknowledge why that might be, and then do your best to share examples or to tell stories that try to show to some extent the severity. But you're talking about different scales. So it depends on who you're talking to and what types of stories that you're telling. It's all true. It's just some people struggle with one side of that spectrum than the other.
My response would be, it's easy to beat up on corporate America for not doing the right thing. And we all think that large corporations have deep pockets, and so they should be able to make changes and do what is right. If you're an individual and you see EPA coming down on you with a fine of $37,000 a day on a farm that has been in the family for 7 generations, and you don't have the deep pockets to make the change that somebody thinks in Washington that you ought to do, you begin to view regulations a little bit differently.
Yeah, so the first part of your comment was talking about how easy it is for us to demonize corporate America. Yes, it is easy for people to try to demonize corporate America. There's actually many Fortune 500 companies that actually want a price on carbon, because if there's a price on carbon, they can incorporate it into their business strategies, and ultimately it helps them be a better business because they can be more economically efficient, but also helps them there probably are some people who want to engage in better corporate responsibility, but there's actually more companies that advocating for a market signal than you might think, because it's actually beneficial to them. So that's one reason why a lot of people don't like more and more regulation, because they're like, there's other mechanisms for being able to maybe target this problem in different ways other than regulation. But if there's nothing coming out, let's say from Congress, on coming up with some pricing scheme, then that's why you see more and more regulation, because it's the only policy tool that is otherwise then available for us to try to set some kind of national signal on how we control carbon. But on EPA regulation generally, I actually interned for a compliance and enforcement division for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. I learned a lot about how there's really bad policies sometimes that BP as a major organization pays because they did something they weren't supposed to, they polluted more than they could, but you know what, it probably was not going to kill them to pay their $30,000 fine. But how the guy who had an underground leaking storage tank is still violating his permit, and he's 80 years old and has no other income, and he gets slapped with a fine that he can't pay. So regulation isn't perfectly applied. It doesn't mean that there can't be better policies. I think there can be, but they have to be informed by how we make things more fair and accurate, so that the people that are polluting don't pollute. They have incentive not to, because that's harmful to people and harmful to the environment, but doesn't just go after people unfairly in a way that either bankrupts them or it doesn't allow them to do things that aren't otherwise harmful. But EPA right now doesn't have any carbon regulations that directly impact the individual. The Clean Power Plan, something that you might have heard of, it actually specifically targets coal-fired power plants. So it's designed to regulate right now, one of the dirtiest, most CO2 polluting industries that are out there, for what it's worth.
Join me, thank you. You may have other questions or comments for Rachel, and so we've got some food.